Hey, just wanted to do a quick video to take you through something I've been working on recently. Quest is coming up really soon. If you're not from Australia and you don't know what Quest is, basically it's Australia's biggest LARP battle game. It starts on April 1st and it kind of goes for 7 days, including setup and pack down. So I find leading up to Quest, I'm often stressed out. I have 50 different projects I want to finish. I have to do things for other people as well, not to mention being a warband leader. There's often a lot that you have to organize because you're responsible for your members. So this Quest, I decided to do something a little bit different. I actually sat down and I wrote out everything that I wanted to make because my costume's in massive need of an overhaul. I haven't really changed anything in, gosh, it has to be a year and a half. I've added small things, but I've mostly fallen back on my Arm Street employee discount and just bought things instead of actually making things for myself. So I decided to prioritize myself this Quest and actually make myself some cool new stuff. So I kind of broke it down into a project a week. Some weeks I have kind of 2 smaller projects because it's something easy. But the first thing I really wanted to make was a leather pouch. I've had this old, awful leather, I don't even have any pictures of it. It's a really awful pouch. I've had it since I think I made it before Chesterwick even launched. Like it was, I don't know, it was a bit of an experiment. And I've always had, I have a good sword belt, I have a nice scabbard, but a pouch is just somewhere I've always fallen short, and I really want to just make something for myself, because Kieran's an amazing leather worker. He makes me some, I'm sorry, my cat is just, can you stop? Oh my god. Sorry. She's got the morning crazies. Anyway, I just wanted to make something myself. So, I started out with historical research. There's this really, really great document called Purses and Pieces that my friend Link sent me. Thank you, Link. Link is a 14th century reenactor and just has an absolute ton of knowledge, and he's been really, really helpful. I'll put links to everything I reference below. So it kind of breaks down the 14th century kidney pouch and all the different pieces it should contain so that you can kind of start to visualize when you're making a pattern what it should look like. My warband, if you aren't aware, we're called Chesterwick. We're based on a 14th century royal court, so we tend to be on the more noble side of things. Our costumes are expected to be a little bit more fancy, and of course within that 14th century time period. So it's we kind of go from, we say the Battle of Cressy to the Battle of Agincourt, so it is a pretty big time period. People think it's really specific, but it's actually not, especially given that there was a massive kind of revolution when it came to fashion, especially in the... Can you not? Look at her. Does that look like the face of someone who's sorry? No, you just want to bite me. I'm sorry, my cat is crazy today, but I can't kick her out of here or she's going to start yowling at me, so I'll have to live with it. Anyway, especially given that in the mid-14th century, especially post-plague, there is a massive shift in fashion, especially towards really, really tight clothing. So it's actually, so far as fashion goes, a really, really interesting time period. And pouches were one of those things that some of them were really bland, some of them were really magnificent. So I tried to lean towards making something a little bit fancier. I'll put a picture up on the screen of it now, and then I'll actually show you in the video too.
So I've done a little bit of leatherworking. I've made belts and some smaller pouches before, so I would say I'm familiar with it, but I'm not by any means experienced or an expert. So part of making this pouch was I really wanted to try as many different techniques as possible, do everything properly, cut no corners, and just try to improve on my current skill set so that when I do go on to make other things, hopefully not a pouch ever again, but so that I have those skills there to make some really beautiful pieces. So this is the pouch. It's not the biggest kidney pouch. A lot of Chesterwick are making them at the moment too. We ran a workshop for them. So it's not the biggest, but it's also not the smallest. I think most of its size is actually coming from here, which is where the belt goes through, which I think is kind of funny because my belt is only like 10 mil wide. I don't have a big belt. But just the one I based it on, I really liked. I just love that shape of it, how it comes up and how it hangs. I think it's really cool. So it kind of consists of two main pieces. There's the top piece, which is the green part, and so that wraps all the way around to the back. And then the bottom part, the black part, that's two pieces sewn together in the middle, like you would if you're making a fabric pouch, basically. So I'll take you through how I made it, because unfortunately I didn't take any videos because at the time all I was thinking was I want to get this done. But I did take a fair amount of pictures, so I'll kind of talk you through the pictures, and hopefully that's somewhat interesting for you. So the first thing I did was figure out how I wanted it to look. So I ended up basing it on a 14th century pilgrim's badge, the kind of thing you'd find at a cast pewter. It was a picture in Purses and Pieces, that document I referenced earlier, and I just loved the shape of it. I thought it was really cute, and I hadn't really seen anything quite like it before in an actual pouch. So that's what I based it on. I deviated slightly as I made it, but it was a really, really good starting point. So the first thing I did was I figured out what the two pieces would look like, the top and the bottom. I cut them out of paper, and I kind of stuck them together to see what they would look like. I find either cutting it out of paper or cardboard are really, really good ways to start when you're leatherworking, because it will kind of imitate your final product without you having to cut it out of leather and waste materials. It took a little bit of experimentation to get exactly the right shape, because obviously you want the whole thing to be symmetrical and you're going to be using that as a pattern, so you want to make sure it's perfect. So once I got the paper pattern right, I went and I took the top part and I cut it out of my 1.5 mil veg tan leather. Difference between veg tan and chrome tan basically is chrome tan is chemically treated. It's very difficult to get embossing into it, difficult to dye. Often it already comes a color, so you can't dye it at all. I avoid using it just because it is more of a kind of a modern convenience than anything else, and I just prefer to work with veg tan leather because it holds embossing well, it dyes beautifully, and it's just much easier to work with and closer to what would have actually been used in medieval times as well. So I just used a pencil to mark it out basically. Made sure it's one of those things where you really do want to measure twice, cut once, because leather isn't cheap and you don't want to mess it up. So once I cut it out of my leather, I ended up actually just using fabric scissors for it because it was thin enough. Often you'll want to use a craft knife or something a little bit stronger, but with the 1.5 mil, I found it was fine. 2 mil, you're definitely not going to be able to use fabric scissors. So once I had it cut out, the first thing I wanted to do was bevel the edges. So I used an edge beveler. I have one here. That's what it looks like. So it kind of has a little blade right in the middle. And you kind of run it along the edge of the leather, and it's going to take your leather from a square edge into more of a rounded edge. Because of the width of the leather, I found that it didn't actually bevel that well, especially on the backside of it. Just the grain wasn't working for me, so I just took some fine grained sandpaper and I finished it that way. You just don't want any fuzzy stuff at the side of your leather. Basically, it makes it look unfinished. You'll probably notice, now that I've pointed it out, that a lot of commercial belts that you buy for reenactment, their edges aren't finished at all, they just have a raw edge. I think that finishing leather is incredibly important, and I heavily promote trying to finish your leather properly, because your finished product is going to be much nicer, and it just builds good habits with leatherworking. So once I beveled the edges, I took a stitch groover, this guy. Basically, you can change this here so it can go different widths, and you just run it along. You just run it along the edge and create a groove. So when I'm stamping my stitching in later, it's all going to be uniform. You can see on the finished thing how, for the most part, it all runs at about 5 mils from the edge. Instead of if you just go and you kind of freehand stamping things, you're not going to have it all uniform. So I marked out all of the lines with a very light pencil. It was actually, since I did it quite lightly, it was easy to erase them if I messed it up. Luckily, I didn't mess it up too much. The lines on it didn't end up being 100% perfect, but they were close enough, and especially once I got the basket weave on there, you can't really tell. So I used the edge groover. I actually used that to put in the lines, and then this is just like a little basket weave embossing tool to get all of the patterns on it. When you do embossing, you have to wet the leather first, otherwise the leather isn't going to take the pressure, because you're just trying to press the pattern into the leather, and once you get water down on it and it dries, it's actually going to keep that shape, whereas if you just do it onto the dry leather, it's not going to. I went and I punched all of the holes before I dyed it as well. All of the holes are there because I was later going to sew in a lining, and with leather you really have to plan ahead with things. It's not like sewing where you can just go, I'm going to sew these two pieces together, and you do it. You have to punch all of your holes ahead of time. Everything has to match up perfectly because you can't just put a needle through leather. It's quite different, and it takes a little bit more patience. So I went around, I already had the groove that I'd put in from the stitch groover, so I then took a hole punch. I used this guy, and I put all the holes all the way around it. So once all of the embossing is done, including all along the edges, I just used a slightly smaller embossing tool for that. I don't have it handy, but it's similar to the basket weave one, just smaller, and it's kind of a teardrop shape. Once absolutely all of that is done, that's when you can start to think about dyeing your leather. I use just Angelus dyes. They're alcohol-based. I'd love to get into actually mixing my own dyes at some point, but that just isn't quite something I've progressed into yet. You can get oil-based dye as well. I just go with Angelus because it's what we had on hand, and it had the colors that I wanted. So I did a few tests of color. I took some squares, stamped basket weave into it, and then put a fitting next to it to try and figure out what's going to look best together. It was actually a really hard decision because it all looked pretty good, especially when you put anything with pewter, it's going to look awesome. Except blue. I find that blue looks better with bronze. But I ended up going with the green because it's one of the colors of Chesterwick. And I liked how the embossing held it, like it looked a bit deeper. I quite liked that. So I ended up dyeing most of it green, but then the edges I went in with a Q-tip and I did the edges the English tan color, which I thought was a really good decision. I'm really happy with how that came out. Once you finish dyeing, especially if you're using an alcohol-based dye, it's really important that you condition your leather, otherwise it basically turns into cardboard. So I use Neat's Foot oil. It's my favorite. You can get it at any kind of leatherworking shop. They usually sell it. It just, basically because you used the alcohol to take the moisture out of the leather, you just want to put it back in. So once I kind of oiled the leather, let it dry, I'm pretty sure I left it overnight. Once I was done with that, I put in the fittings. The little circle fittings are actually buttons, which I ended up taking little clips clipped off the end of the button, bent them out, put them in, and then hammered them down, because I didn't have any circular pewter fittings other than the acorns, really, and it worked. So once all the fittings were in, I was kind of at the point where I wanted to do the bottom of my pouch to figure out how that was going to work. So the bottom half of the pouch was much easier than the top half. I just did the lines on it, I dyed it, turned it inside out, sewed around it. As you would a garment, for example, if you're making a hat, you sew it inside out, then you turn it right side in, that way you don't have exposed stitching. I did a similar thing with this pouch. The only difference really to fabric, and this is really important if you are making a pouch and you are using sheepskin for the bottom of it, is I wet all of the seams. I clipped around all the corners just so there wasn't quite as much leather to be bunched up in the corners, and then I hammered it all flat, all the seams flat. I mean, if you imagine a piece of fabric where you've sewn the seams flat, just how much nicer it sits. It's exactly the same with leather, especially when you're turning it inside out. If you don't hammer everything flat, then it can kind of bunch up and look kind of puffy, whereas hammering it flat, turning it inside out, and then again hammering it there, that's how you end up with this nice flat profile and, kind of these nice crisp edges on it. If I hadn't have done all the hammering at the time, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have ended up as nice. So once I had it turned inside out, I found a wool that I wanted to use as the lining. It ended up being the same wool that I used for the lining of the top part as well. So I kind of just traced around the pouch, sewed a little wool pouch, and stuck it in. And then I just turned it over on the edge, like where you put your hand into the pouch, and did a bit of an altered blanket stitch to sew it down. It was not the easiest, but because it's sheepskin, I was able to just punch everything with an awl, which is just a pokey boy. So there's how the lining kind of ended up looking, because I mean that's where you go in. So it's just a little bit of a decorative stitch to make it look a bit nicer and also sew the wool down really well. And once that was sewn in, I was pretty much done with the bottom. So I started thinking about the top again and realized that the last thing I had to do before the lining was sew on the strapping and figure out how it was going to go together. So it has two straps, one at the back, one at the front. They're both hand stitched on. I ended up taking the stitching down and all the way around for the sake of continuity, so that aesthetically everything kind of fit together. So the back one has the buckle, and the front one has the little belt end, and they go together to do it up. So when measuring it, all I really had to take into account was how long does it have to be so that they're going to be able to go under and back up. So I did the usual, punched holes, sewed those on, and then the final thing to do was the lining. And the lining was probably the most work, probably ended up being the most rewarding thing, because I was really happy with how it came out. Something I didn't really consider with it was that I would kind of be sewing blind, because I used spray contact adhesive to stick down the wool. The wool would fray horribly, so I had to be quite careful with it. So once I kind of had it folded over and ready to sew, I couldn't actually see the holes that I was sewing anymore. So, and it's not, as I mentioned earlier, it's not like fabric where you can just poke a needle through. It already has preset holes, so I would have to find them. So it was a little bit like a puzzle. I thought it was really fun, if not a little bit frustrating, but it was a good experience, and I was really, really happy with the result. It's something that most people probably aren't even going to notice about the pouch, unfortunately. It's kind of subtle, but it looks excellent, and I'm really happy with that. So once that was done, the only thing I really had left to do was to sew it together. So I just had 2 stitches along the top, and I used kangaroo thonging. You can see it there. Yes, kangaroo, very medieval. They definitely existed in 14th century England. And you can just use a linen thread, regular thread for that. Completely depends on the design of your pouch, but I just decided to do the 2 short little bits because I thought it looked nice. And once that was done, I breathed a sigh of relief because, it was about 40 hours of work. I was pretty tired by the end of it, but it felt really good to get something done. Like a lot of my friends, I can be a chronic procrastinator. I will start other projects instead of finishing projects. And really this whole kind of thing-a-week exercise for me has been to make me actually finish things. So yeah, I'm really pleased with that. I used it on Friday. I have a few things to change on it just to make it a bit more robust, but yeah, it's pretty great and I'm happy. So hopefully you learned something or at least found it interesting how it was assembled. Let me know if you have any questions. I've since helped most members of Chesterwick assemble their own pouches, so I'm kind of starting to know what I'm doing. And hopefully I'll be back next week with the mittens I made, because they were my next project. So yeah, see you next time.
Yeah, it's at least like three mugs of tea in that, I reckon.
So I did all of the embossing, and then I started to think about dyeing. You want to, yes.